I am Italian, and a real privilege to share a bit of my story with you, but I was born into a large, very loud Italian-American family in New Jersey. And I would say that we were sort of basically culturally Catholic. So we didn't go to church. It didn't reflect what we believed, but we loved getting together for big family holidays, eating lots of Italian food. And for me, Santa and God were basically the same thing. And I found this pretty recently. I don't know if you can, okay, you can see it here. So I had just learned to write cursive, whenever that is, so I'm pretty young. And my brother and I, we used to write letters and send them off through the chimney. Some of you probably have done this, to Santa. Tell him what you want for Christmas, and then hopefully you get it. And this is what I wanted for Christmas. I wanted the answer to this question: Dear Santa and God, was God ever born? So those philosophical gears were turning at a young age, and I liked that I thought one of them was going to have the answer, and I could get this letter to them both through the chimney to the same location. They clearly lived together, and Santa and God were very closely related in my mind. Two respects in which I thought they were basically identical. One, they loved me based on how good I was. So Santa had that list. He was checking it twice. If I did more good than bad, I was going to get some gifts. If not, I was going to get coal. God had a list. He was checking it. If I did more good than bad, then I was going to go to heaven. If not, I was going to be in trouble. And second respect, I thought they were the same, was I thought it was a matter of blind faith. Okay, you couldn't look into arguments for Santa, and you couldn't look into arguments for God. You either just believed in them or you didn't. Now, I remember the conversation when I found out that Santa didn't exist. Who remembers that conversation? Good number of people. I was the last one of my friends to find out, and they told me, and sort of made fun of me as they told me. And I remember, feeling like a fool. I remember feeling silly. I remember feeling like I had been duped. And I didn't want to feel that way again. So I became skeptical, not just of Santa, but of God as well. And that carried me through some of those younger years. And I arrived at Princeton University to study philosophy as a skeptical philosophy student. I was playing soccer at the time. Two of my soccer teammates challenged me to read the Bible. I wasn't that interested, but I was always up for a challenge. I began to read through it. I would cross things out. I would add things in the margins. I'd write a big BS in the margin wherever I disagreed, and Christians would look over my shoulder and say, Vince, why do you have a BS in the margin of your Bible? And I would say, oh, that verse makes for a great Bible study. That was my starting point, but I did take that challenge. I continued reading the Bible, and as I did, I found lots of things I never expected to see. I started to read through and I started to find words, and I wrote a list of these words. I found words like disputing and debating and reasoning and explaining and persuading and even proving. I read that the Bereans were more noble than the Thessalonians. Why? Not because they took some blind leap of faith, but it says because they examined the scriptures daily to determine if what they were being told was true. Exactly what we're doing this week. And then I got to 1 Corinthians 15, the beginning of that chapter. There's this incredibly early creed, I'm sure you'll hear about it later this week, where it says that hundreds of people, right after Jesus died, were walking around utterly convinced that they had spent time with this dead man after he had been killed. And it says in parentheses, most of whom are still living. In other words, don't take my word for it. Go out and ask them yourself. And I kept reading, and I got all the way back to the book of Hebrews. I came across a biblical definition of faith. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. Evidence. And I thought to myself, I was wrong. I thought this is not a God who's asking me to take some blind leap of faith. Far from it. This is not a God who's asking me to park my brain at the door. This is a God who's asking me to love him not only with all of my heart and with all of my soul and with all of my strength, but also with all of my mind. And I can remember reasoning to myself. I can remember saying, if God made me, if he made me with this mind, then he would want an honest intellectual search to point in his direction. So I arranged meetings with the two top New Testament professors at Princeton University at the time in the religion department, neither of them Christians, neither of them believers, but I got together with them. And I said, can you help me to explain this? I opened up to that passage in 1 Corinthians 15. And I said, this is what I'm finding. There's this early history where hundreds of people seem utterly convinced that they've spent time with this man Jesus after he clearly had been killed. His death should have been the end of the movement. And now very shortly thereafter, you have the eruption of Christianity, and all of these people walking around convinced they had eaten breakfast with him on the beach and had conversations with him and spent time with him. How do you account for that? I say Christians are telling me that the miracle of the resurrection bridges that gap. If you don't bridge it that way, what is your explanation? And one of those professors glanced without conviction in the direction of a mass hallucination theory. It's a theory that's riddled with problems. We'll talk about it later in the week. It's earned no degree of credibility in the scholarly literature. The other professor told me that as a historian, he simply wasn't interested in the question. And the assumption seemed to be that as soon as we start to talk about the miraculous, we're simply no longer talking about history. But I've never been able to understand why he thought he could just make that assumption in the first place, rather than looking at the evidence and following it wherever it led. I learned two very important things through those meetings, and they're important things for you to know as you head off to college. First, just because someone is very smart does not mean that they have good, thought-through answers to the deepest questions of life. You have to arrange those meetings and sit down with them and ask them the questions. Second, criticism without alternative is empty. Plenty of people were ready and willing to criticize Christianity, but when I asked them for an alternative to put in its place, they didn't have one. And as a non-Christian who was moving towards faith, I began to think through the deepest questions of life, questions of origin and meaning and morality and destiny. Where did we come from? Where are we headed? What's the purpose of life? How should we live? And I realized that Christianity, the person of Jesus, had deep answers to every one of those questions, and no one else did, and nothing else did. The other assumption that really had to get challenged for me was this idea that God loved me based on how good I was. And again, I was reading through the Bible, and that was being challenged over and over. And I got to the story of the prodigal son. And to many of you who maybe grew up in a Christian home, that may seem like such a commonplace, normal, standard story. But to me, it was completely radical. Because here's this son who did everything wrong. He demanded his inheritance. He ran off with it. He wasted it. He's literally eating with the pigs because he's done so much wrong. And now he turns to come back, and the father sees him, it says, still far off on the horizon. And he begins to sprint towards his son. And I've always thought about this passage from the other perspective. What was the son thinking when he saw his father, having done everything wrong? He saw his father sprinting towards him from afar. He probably thought that he was going to get hit. And instead, that father throws himself on his son and kisses him and embraces him and gives him a ring and gives him a robe and gives him sandals on his feet and yells back to the family and says, kill the best animal. We're throwing the biggest party that you've ever seen. My son was lost, but now he's found. God doesn't love me because of how good I am. That's what I needed to learn. He simply loves me because I'm his child. When he looks at me, as unfathomable as this is, he sees something of himself. And this is a picture from yesterday. That's my 4-month-old son, Raphael. That's my first child. And I can't even begin to explain to you what it does to me when I look at this picture. And you react yourself. There's Raphael. Hi, Raphael. You react yourself. And imagine, for me, when I look at this picture, and that's my child, and I see my image in him. I see a likeness of myself in him. I heard a poem the other day, and there was a line in it. It said, my chest became a cathedral. And that's what I feel when I look at this. And how amazing that God feels that when he looks at us. It's not Santa counting up our good deeds and our bad deeds. It's looking at one's son. And when I realized that God's love was unconditional, when I realized that God's love couldn't be earned and it couldn't be lost, it was the same on my best day and on my very worst day, that freed me to begin to be honest about what was in my heart. And there was a lot of darkness in my heart. Okay, before I gave my life to Jesus, I was someone who would never ask for forgiveness. Never. No matter what I had done wrong to you, no matter how many times I had done it, I would never ask for forgiveness. And I was somebody who was full of unfaithfulness. Before I met Jesus, I had never dated someone that I didn't cheat on. And through that, there was a lot of brokenness in my life, and I almost lost completely the relationships with the people who meant the most to me. I ultimately got to a place where I not only believed up here that Jesus was who he said he was, but I tried to live life on my own strength, and I knew that I couldn't be the person that deep down I knew I was created to be without a strength that was beyond myself. And so in 122 Jolene Hall on Princeton University's campus, I dropped to my knees, and I not only told God that I believed him, but I told him that I needed him, that I needed his strength in my life. And right then, I became a Christian. And how amazing it is that I could become a Christian right then and right there. I didn't have to wait because God wasn't asking me to do good things to try to work my way up to him. He was simply asking me to accept that he had already done everything to come down to me and make relationship with me right. Just one last thing I want to leave you with. About 2 weeks later, I found myself on a mission trip to Panama City Beach, Florida, over spring break. I didn't even know what a mission trip was. All I knew was some of my friends were going down there, and all of a sudden I'm walking along on the beach with these other Christians. I barely know what's going on, and we're sharing about Jesus with these college students that had come down to the beach to drink their faces off for a week. And it was the weirdest thing to me. But 2 weeks after I became a Christian, on that beach, there was one guy, I can still see his face so vividly, and there was one man who we spoke to. And as we did, for the first time, he began to see Jesus for who he truly is. And I can remember the exact moment when I physically saw in his eyes the moment where it made sense, the moment where Jesus gripped his heart, the moment where he moved from death to life. And that's an invitation that God makes to every one of us to be a part of. And it is utterly, utterly incredible that you could be used by God, participate with him in the act of literally saving someone's life, not just physically, but for all eternity. And I've tried to take every opportunity I could to be involved in that ever since. When I think back on my story, there are 3 absolutely critical moments. There's the moment where God got through to my head. There's the moment where God got through to my heart. And then there was the moment where God used me to get through to someone else. Okay, I think that as Christians, we need all 3 of those moments. And it may be that as you sit here and I just list those 3 things, you say, I've had one of those. Or I've had 2 of those. But this week is an invitation to have all 3 of those moments and to know God and to love God and to serve God in your head, in your heart, and by sharing him with others. The Christian faith is the only gift that you can only truly have if you are giving it away.